welcome to everyone in this country and also abroad. And Remco, special welcome to you and congratulations really on the publication of your book that'll make a fine contribution to what we know about theatrical productions of Anne Frank. We're about 2 weeks away from Yom HaShoah, the day set aside every year to encourage people to recall the persecutions and mass murder of Jews during the Nazi period. It's impossible to keep in mind one by one, 6 million people. And consequently, the mind, limited as it is, although also eager to know, is fastened on individuals. And no individual, as Gunther just said, has drawn more attention, at least no victim has drawn more attention than has Anne Frank. What we see in reading her diary and then looking at various adaptations of the diary is what we know about Holocaust memory and historical memory as such, namely, memory of the historical past is never permanently fixed. It changes over time, depending on various circumstances and the like. We can say, on the one hand, that the Holocaust well may be the most copiously documented crime in history. We certainly don't lack for sources, and we know a great deal about it. Most people, however, don't go to historical sources in order to tap into this history. For every person, let's say, who's read Raoul Hilberg's magisterial books on the Holocaust or Shaul Friedlander's, far more have read the diary of Anne Frank or been to the theater to see the stage version of the diary of Anne Frank, or seen the film, or visited the house on the Prinsengracht in Amsterdam and the like. So who is the Anne Frank whom we remember? In many ways, that question will receive many different answers, depending on time, place, context, and the like. For our purposes, though, very briefly, I just want to say that the play version by Goodrich and Hackett, 1955, probably brought Anne Frank's story to the attention of more people in America, Europe, and elsewhere than the diary itself, at least in the beginning. The diary has been published in something like 60 languages and perhaps as many as 30 million copies. But it's the stage version of Anne Frank who I think has given us the Anne Frank that most people associate with. And that's an Anne Frank who's a very inspirational figure. Her signature line, twice repeated in that play, the line for which she's best known, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart, accurately captures one part of Anne Frank, but only one part. It is, however, the part that a great many people favor. So how did that come about? We would need more time to sketch it in great detail, but I want to call your attention to two figures who had a major role in giving us this cheery, buoyant, hopeful, and ultimately triumphal figure of Anne Frank. One was Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, the only member of those people who had been in hiding for 2 years and a month on the Prinsengracht. He survived and devoted the rest of his life to really shaping the memory of Anne Frank that he wanted the world to have. Soon after the diary appeared in English, an American writer named Meyer Levin set about to write a play version of the diary. And he shared it, or at least he shared news about it with Otto Frank, who wrote him back as follows, and I quote, "As to the Jewish issue," writing to Meyer Levin, "you are right that I do not feel the same way you do. I always said that Anne's book is not a war book. War is the background. It's not a Jewish book either, though the Jewish sphere, sentiment, and surrounding is the background. I never wanted a Jew writing an introduction for it. It is read and understood more by Gentiles than in Jewish circles, so do not make a Jewish play out of it." That set back Meyer Levin, whose play was, in fact, in many respects, faithful to the Jewish side of Anne Frank's story, but that's not what was approved. Rather, the play was given over to two American playwrights, Goodrich and Hackett. They were very successful in writing a version of Anne Frank's story that became hugely popular. The play's first director, however, Garson Kanin, was very much in line with what Otto Frank had to say. He played a major role in de-Judaizing the figure of Anne Frank and also universalizing the Anne Frank and giving us a happier version of Anne Frank than one might otherwise glean from a reading of the diary, and most especially from knowledge of what happened to Anne Frank post Amsterdam, when she was sent with the others to Westerbork, Auschwitz, and then Bergen-Belsen, where she perished. I don't want to take any more time right now. I'd rather pass on to have my colleagues speak, but I'd be glad to elaborate on these particular developments in showcasing a particular version of Anne Frank that remains the dominant version to this day.
Esther, please go ahead. You need to unmute yourself first.
I'll unmute myself first. Okay, so I focus a little bit more about general ideas about the Second World War and maybe some literature. So my question would be, more than 75 years after the Second World War, why do we still need to talk about it and study its many facets? At the end, I hope to give you my answer to that question. So maybe I should remind you first of the impact in general in the Netherlands. 5 long years of occupation, one of the longest occupation by the Germans in Europe. Many fatalities among soldiers, resistance fighters, and civilians. The forced employment of many men in Germany and the so-called hunger winter. All those aspects of the war left a huge impact on the collective memory of many Dutch men and women. But that all pales in comparison with the fate of Dutch Jews. So that's one very obvious reason why we still should be talking about Anne Frank and her story and many others in similar conditions. Because of the impact, it makes sense what happens in the Netherlands since the end of World War II in 1945. Almost every year since then, there have been books published, fiction and non-fiction, so scholarly works, and also new movies are released almost every year. I don't dare to say every year, but that might be even true also. However, you can observe in both, so in literature and in movies, a slight shift in direction since the end of the 1940s. From the focus on victims and the resistance, and now the shift is more on maybe collaborators and the second generation of survivors, so children of the Jews or about other Dutch people involved in the Second World War, bystanders, Dutch SS soldiers, and Jew hunters. So we all know Anne Frank's story, I suppose. And in general, we know all about the atrocities that happened during the Holocaust. In my view, but not only my view, silence is not golden, as we need to tell the stories of what happened, in probably the idle hope that history will not be repeated. So silence is not an option. Therefore, the study of what happened during the years of the Second World War is very important. In my classes, for instance, I try to give students perspective by reading all of Anne's writings, not only her diary, but also her short stories, and compare them to other texts, similar texts, including diaries from other Jewish occupants of concentration camps. I don't want to argue what exactly qualifies as Holocaust literature, but if we follow Eli Wiesel's statement that it's a form of testimonial writing, we cannot not include the most famous name and her writings. An example that new collaborations still happen, probably the most renowned research institute of the Netherlands, the Huygens Institute, together with the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, have been collaborating on the scholarly edition of a new historical research into the manuscripts of Anne Frank. This research focuses on Anne Frank's development as a writer and on the event that she describes. Anne Frank's digitized manuscripts are since 2021, so last year, available in their entirety for the first time. You cannot access them, by the way, here in the US. They're geo-blocked. To give you an example of a recent new discovery in combination to what I just mentioned, in 2018, the Anne Frank House, together with the aforementioned Huygens Institute and the Dutch Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, presented 2 new pages from Anne Frank's first diary, you know, the one with the red checked cover. Another shift that took place in the Netherlands, but I'm almost sure I might be corrected by the Dutch in the audience, I think is that nowadays there is a little bit more openness. If you want to talk about the black page in Dutch history, why did 75% of the Dutch Jews perish? A percentage you probably only see in Eastern Europe, but not in a Western country. The answer for me to my first question, why do we still need to talk about the World War, the Holocaust and all its effects? We should never forget a research that has to continue in order to make sure that it will never ever be forgotten. So that's kind of a general note about why would you study anything from that period, I think. So that was a very short view on why should we still talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Dr. Ansel, please go ahead. You reconnected. The audience didn't see it, but you had you were out for a few minutes, but you back on. Very good. Please go ahead.
I indeed missed part of the first talk by Professor Rosenfeld. So first of all, I'd like to thank Conteo for organizing this webinar and Professor Professor Rosenfeld for joining in. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss this complicated legacy of Anne Frank and more generally the topic of Holocaust awareness and memory culture. So let me give a brief outline of my project, or at least as brief as possible. So this monograph that I recently published reconstructs the first performance of the diary of Anne Frank in the Netherlands in the late 50s. 1956 was the opening night in November. I was able to do this thanks to a number of available archives, among other things, 2 moving boxes that I found with the son of the then director. And that was full of material like the prompt books, letters, photography, the tapes, and a few props as well. And I also interviewed the 2 surviving members of the original cast, now in their 80s, the actor that played Peter and the actress that played Margot. So this Dutch production followed upon the original American production of The Diary of Anne Frank that premiered in October 1955. And the play, as we have already heard, was written by the couple Goodrich and Hackett, the Hacketts, so to speak. So next, this play was translated, distributed around the world, along with very specific directions on how to stage the play. The cast, the American production, toured the country. The cast was changing meanwhile. And later on, local professional companies were able to set up smaller productions. Finally, it was the turn of amateur groups. So the play was a commercial and an artistic success in a way. So the producers had set up a diary company, and that, that paid those that had subscribed for shares, rather wealthy. And the play won a Pulitzer Prize indeed, and was awarded with several other accolades. European companies were very much interested, and from 1956 on, the play was performed in just about every country in Europe, North, South, East, and West. East Germany, for instance, Hungary, Romania, Greece. In each instant, it had to be translated with the American rights holders taking care that absolutely nothing would be changed. The play was also staged in Japan, Australia, Southern America. So in Argentina, at one point, 5 productions were produced simultaneously. 2 Spanish versions, 1 Italian, a German, and a Yiddish version. Now, from this overview, one can imagine there lies a certain tension in the strict demands that were set by the American producers, and the necessity and the wish to translate play into a viable show that is set up within a specific national, historical and cultural context. Clearly, this is, of course, also a tension that's at the heart of theater. First, there's already this precarious relationship between the text, the script, the original script, and a translation. But there's also the translation in a less literal and a more figurative sense. So more generally speaking, let me say a little more about that. So with all the success, there was considerable criticism of the script, indeed, from the opening night onwards and ever since. The thrust of the critique, I believe, was that the playwrights and the director, Kanin indeed, would have squandered the diary, not only by changing the spirit of Anne's text, but also literally by altering crucial sentences and changing characters, among whom was Anne Frank herself, beyond recognition. And indeed, there was this, as you might know, this previous adapter named Meyer Levin, an author who had given Otto Frank the idea of a play. He did indeed write 2 versions, but at one point, a moment in which the English translation in the United States became very successful, the American agent went looking for another playwright, the Hacketts. The quarrel that unfolded has been documented quite well, but interesting here is his harsh critique that the Hackett's play betrayed Anne's Jewishness. Jewishness was actually the word that was used also in the lawsuit that unfolded. And it also betrayed the unique Jewish dimensions of the persecution and the genocide. Jewishness had been purged from the play for commercial reasons, perhaps also for other reasons. This criticism has never ceased. Only when the first script was thoroughly rewritten in the 1990s, after the publication of the critical edition, the complete diaries of Anne Frank, some of the major problematic lines and dramatizations were rectified. However, at the same time, it led to new discussion about the fundamental flaws in the play. As such, I don't go against this criticism, yet what I'm trying to say is that with regard to the Netherlands, and I hope to make it by looking at the global stage history, for which I'm actually now conducting research in the United States, is that we should not dwell on the text. And the second argument that I would like to make has to do with the memory culture in the short and long term. So the first point that I would like to make is that we should accept that the script, as all text, has an unfixed and an unstable meaning. There's no essence, in a sense, to deviate from. And the same goes for the diary on which the script was based. Second, we should appreciate the specific circumstance of a theater that offers an event that is repetitive at the same time as it is unique, every night in interaction with audiences. So to put it in more concrete terms, for instance, in the publications I'm working on, when you look at the reenactment of the Hanukkah scene, that's a key scene in the play, you can see that it was not dramatized or understood in the same fashion everywhere, even though the American team very much tried to impress one uniform staging. In the Netherlands, for instance, to forestall critique, prayers and singing were pronounced in Hebrew instead of English, and a different song was chosen. Moreover, the war context of the Netherlands, of Germany, but also of France and Spain, meant that the play was experienced in a completely different way than in the US. For some cast members and translators and producers, the play was very close to their own experience in Europe. So this could also lead to tensions, for instance, when the European directors or translators weren't very eager to accept what they saw as pedantic demands from Broadway. So that would be my first argument. The second, and I conclude with that, has to do with memory culture. So the play was a very important moment in the remembrance culture of the Shoah in the Netherlands, probably elsewhere in the short and longer term. I know we'll be discussing this, I suppose, that the play has been critiqued for disconnecting the notion of the Holocaust from actual atrocities and reinforcing the idea that Anne's diary is, so to speak, the ultimate Holocaust experience. But for now, I wish to emphasize how simultaneously with the Dutch performance of the play and with the Dutch stage manager as one of the driving forces, all kinds of initiatives were taken to honor the memory of Anne Frank, directly related to the tour that the theater, that the play was making at the time. So a monument in transit camp Westerbork was considered for the first time. Anne's primary school was renamed. The secret annex was saved from demolition. The Anne Frank Foundation was established, or the beginnings of that. Last year, the National Holocaust Monument was unveiled in Amsterdam at last. And the foundation stone for this was laid by Jacqueline van Maassen, Anne's best friend, because she, van Maassen, had made a large donation to the monument after she had auctioned one of Anne's poems. So, and the idea for this donation was suggested by Jeroen Krabbe, the actor and director who was responsible for the play's second major production in 1984. So the donation, as was pointed out by Van Maassen, could be seen as a belated gift by Anne Frank. It also was a kind of a contribution and a continuation of the close bonds between the play and Holocaust commemoration in the Netherlands. Thank you.